Hello and welcome to the Gravel Ride podcast. I'm your host, Craig Dalton. This week on the show, I'm handing the microphone off to my co-host, Randall Jacobs, who's got veteran cycling journalist Caley Fretz on the pod to discuss some of the challenges and opportunities facing cycling journalism. You may know Caley from his work as editor-in-chief over at CyclingTips, and prior to that over at Velo News. Both publications have undergone some downsizing of late. The economic headwinds facing professional journalists are strong, particularly in the cycling world. If we want to have quality reporting and storytelling, a new model needs to emerge. I don't know where this is all going to end up, but I was super excited that Kaylee agreed to join Randall on the podcast to just get his perspective and to get into some good old-fashioned bike geekery. Before we jump in, we need to thank this week's sponsors from Thesis and Logos Components. As many of you know, I'm a longtime Thesis OB1 rider. For a limited time, Thesis is offering $500 off a Thesis OB1 with Access Custom wireless shifting and your choice of high-end carbon wheels. It's a bike that I can personally attest stands up to every other carbon bike out there on the market at a really great price. One of the things that I've always appreciated about Thesis is that they allow a unique level of customization. So if you want size appropriate cranks down to, I think 160 or 165 millimeters, you can do that. You can get your stem size. You can customize everything based on a free one-on-one consult. So go check out thesis.bike or contact hello@thesis.bike to get started. I also want to give a shout out to Logos Components. Logos just received huge recognition from bikepacking.com and was awarded the Gear of the Year award for the wheel set category in 2022. You might recall an episode we did a while back on how to choose a gravel wheel set, where Randall went through detail by detail on the design considerations when constructing a carbon wheel set. I encourage you to listen to that, as it provided a lot of riders with reflection on what they were looking for and what all the different things were. All Logos wheels are built on proven open standards with non-proprietary components and with a manufacturing precision that rivals anybody in the industry. The wheels are backed by Logos' 5-year warranty, lifetime at-cost incident protection, and a US-based warehouse and support team to keep you rolling for many years to come. So head on over to logoscomponents.com and use the code CommunityFreeShipping, all one word, to take advantage of a free shipping offer. With that business behind us, I'm going to pass the microphone back over to Randall and his conversation with Caley Fretz.
It's been quite a bit. I think I last saw you at Sea Otter. How have you been? What's going on in your world?
Well, I'm unemployed as of November 15th. We can get that one right out of the way, right? I was part of the layoffs at Outside Inc. To be somewhat differentiated from Outside Magazine for anybody out there. I mean, Outside Inc. does own Outside Magazine, but it also owns lots and lots of other things. Yeah, myself, the editor-in-chief of Velo News as well, and two of the CT staff, two really core CT staff, Matt Deneve, our managing editor, and Dave Rome, one of our tech editors and kind of a legend in space. We're all let go on the same day on November 15th. So I am currently super fun employed. And I think after we chat today, I'm probably going to go skiing because it's snowing up in the mountains right now. And so I'm somewhat enjoying myself. But, fun employment brings with it some level of stress as well. So that's how I'm doing right now.
Sure. Well, and I appreciate you sharing. I think last we rode together, you were still living in Boulder, and you've since moved to beautiful Durango. When was that move?
That was shortly after we had our first child. My wife grew up here, and we have grandparents here to help with childcare and all the rest. And we just wanted to get off the Front Range. No offense to the Front Range. There's too many people, and there's fewer people here. And I can go skiing 18 minutes from here, from my door. And I can't really complain about that.
Housing costs are probably a little bit less bonkers out that way as well. I was in Denver and particularly Boulder lately, and it is nuts.
It's a little bit better here, although not as good as it was 4 or 5 years ago. It's a Zoom town, right? So in the last couple of years, it's gone up like 28% or something ridiculous in 2021. We love it here. It's amazing. Yeah. Durango, the bike community here is unbelievable. The mountain biking is unbelievable. And there's nobody that you have, not as many people to share all the trails with. So we like that bit of it as well.
Very, very cool. And so let's just dive into, because I've been curious. Share a bit about your background. So I've only known you as, in your role as a journalist and editor at Cycling Tips. But how do you end up on this path?
Oh, I mean, how far back do you want to go? I started racing mountain bikes at 12 or 13 years old. My dad was a cyclist. My dad was I think one of the founding members of the Penn State cycling team, collegiate cycling team back in the day. So I grew up around bikes, and I grew up around bike racing and watching the Tour and all these things. And yeah, started racing when my family moved to Burlington, Vermont back in the day at Catamount Family Center.
Anybody Northeast connection.
Yep. Very, very Northeast connection. That's where that was all my youth. Yeah. Any New Englanders.
And your dad is still in Vermont, if I recall correctly, right?
Yeah. He actually just retired, but he used to run a small, like sort of children's museum, aquarium thing called Echo on the waterfront in Burlington. And yeah, so grew up racing, grew up around bikes, and went to school out here in Colorado, mostly to ride my bike, to major in bike racing primarily, much to my parents' chagrin, I would say. And let's see what it would have been like junior year, summer in between junior and senior year of college. Shout out to a friend of mine, Brian Holcomb, who's still in the bike world. Basically came to me and was like, "Hey, you should be an intern at Velo News." And so I did that, and I became an intern at Velo News and worked the summer there. And Ben Delaney was the editor-in-chief at the time, and Ben was kind enough to bring me on in a kind of part-time capacity that fall, and then it kind of just went from there. So. Yeah, a couple folks who are still floating around the bike world, I owe a lot to at this point. Ben and Brian and Zach Vestal, who is sort of one of my first mentors and has been a marketing manager at Niner and Scott and a couple other places recently. Matt, yeah, and just kind of worked from there. So I was a tech editor sort of tech writer at Velo News for a couple of years, tech editor at Velo News for a couple of years, and then kind of worked my way into bigger and broader beats, basically, and kind of stepped into the racing space a little bit more. Became, I think it was senior editor or whatever the title was at the end of my Velo News tenure, which was 2017, which is when Wade Wallace got in touch from Cycling Tips, and he was actually just looking for a person to fill a somewhat similar role, kind of like a features writer, do a bit of everything kind of writer. And I loved the idea. I loved Cycling Tips. I loved the brand. I loved everything it stood for. I loved the fact that it was kind of an up and comer. And I had been at Velo News long enough that I was just looking for a change, basically. And so I jumped ship from one to the other, from Velo News to CT. Remained really good friends with lots of folks at VN, particularly guys like Andrew Hood, who I'd done a bunch of Tours de France with and things like that. Like no hard feelings in that jump, just wanted something new. And within about a year of that, for a number of different reasons, Wade had promoted me to editor-in-chief at CT. So that was around middle of 2018. And it was an interesting time kind of from a business perspective, because it was near the end of a period when CT was owned by Bike Exchange in Australia, and we were about to be purchased by Pink Bike. And with all of that happening, and then particularly with the purchase from Pink Bike, we got a bunch more resource and really could expand into what I think most people probably know Cycling Tips as now, or maybe we'll say 6 months ago, what they knew it as up until quite recently. And yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, there's not. My time as EIC of Cycling Tips is obviously, I think, what most listeners out there would probably know. If not of me, then you at least know Cycling Tips, and you know what we were trying to do there.
I know how much grief there is out there for that core team having been broken up. A lot of people, myself included, who value the perspective that you bring to the industry. It's not simply, flipping press releases, which, there's a place for. Like there's some people they want to see what the press releases are, but doing really interesting journalism. One of your colleagues, Ian Trelaw, he's done some interesting pieces on Central Asian despots and their role in cycling, and on the Afghan women's cycling team, and the controversy with how the UCI was prioritizing getting certain members of that team and the organization out of Afghanistan when the US was backing out. Like, this is not your standard bike industry journalism. And that's an angle that I think is going to be very much missed in the vacuum that's created by your departure and the departure of others from that team.
Yeah, it's a sad thing. I think the overwhelming emotion for a lot of us is just sadness, because we spent a lot of time building this thing, and a lot of time and energy and effort, and no blood, but probably some sweat and tears in there. And yeah, and it feels, that's just sad. I'm I enjoyed my time there tremendously. I enjoyed working with people like Ian, with James Wong, with Dave, who got laid off alongside me. It was just I can't say it was massively surprising, given a number of things that I can't actually talk about, but I am still very saddened by it. Yeah, I mean,
Sure.
It's not going to be what it was because a bunch of the people are gone. Like that I can say. Yeah.
Now, remind me, when did James join the team? Because he's someone I've admired for years.
Yeah, he joined I think about 18 months before I did. So
Okay.
when Bike Exchange, when Wade first sold a large portion of Cycling Tips to Bike Exchange, that was sort of the first, let's say capital infusion that the company got, and a lot of that was used to pick up kind of high profile folks, particularly in the United States, which is what's sort of the next market that Wade wanted to go after. So they picked up James and they picked up Neil Rogers in the US, as well as some other folks like Shane Stokes in the UK or Ireland, I believe he is right now. Yeah, so that was all a little bit before I got there, and part of my sort of what they asked me to do, or what Wade asked me to do when I became editor-in-chief, was to figure out exactly how to best use people like James, who do phenomenal work. I mean, I maintain to this day that the three-person tech team that we had at Cycling Tips over the last year, which would be James and Dave Rome and Ronan McLaughlin in Ireland as well, was the best anywhere in cycling media. There's no question in my mind about that. And so basically trying to figure out how to steer that talent was one of the big things that I was tasked with doing over the last sort of 3-4 years.
Well, and when you read a review from any of those team members, that you're getting it straight, for better or for worse, for the brands that are at the mercy of that team. But honestly, it keeps the industry honest. And I recall early in my career in the bike, and particularly James's writing being something that I referenced constantly. And in fact, when I was at one of the big players, if I needed to make an argument, I would oftentimes grab an article from someone like him to bring to the argument, like, no, press fit is not acceptable. And we're going to spend the extra money and add the weight. And we're going to tell a story about how a two-piece thread together is a better solution. And honestly, it's a solution to fix what was broken when you went, but that's a hobby horse that I think we've all been riding for some time.
I love hearing that, though. I genuinely love hearing that, because, I mean, first of all, James would also love hearing that. He'd be very proud of that fact, I think. And yeah, like we know that was the case, right? I mean, we the three of us have been making a podcast called Nerd Alert for the last year and a half or 2 years or whatever. And I got a fair number of less than pleased emails off the back of that podcast, because we were quite honest in our assessment of what we thought was happening in the industry. And in particular, like, I haven't been a tech editor for 8-9 years. I'm just a cyclist at this point. But Dave and James are so deep inside it, and they spend so much of their lives thinking about that stuff that, yeah, you can't ignore their opinions, right? You absolutely can't ignore their opinions. And I think that's a testament to, one, the fact that they do their research, and two, the fact that they've been right a number of times. And like over the years, I would say that CT was known as the anti-press fit media outlet, right? Which is like, there are worse things to be associated with, I think, than hating on creaky bottom brackets. Like, who wouldn't want to hate on creaky bottom brackets? That makes perfect sense to me.
Well, and it's deeper than just a creaky bottom bracket. It's detracting from this experience that we are all so passionate about. And so I think that having someone out there who has influence saying, no, this is not the way it should be, here are the arguments, and let a case be made. Hey, come on the podcast and talk about why you think press fit is the best way to go about it, if you really want to make that case. But yeah, it's an approach that I'll take you up on it, but I'd probably be on the same side with you on more or less every issue, with the exception of maybe a few nuances here and there. But yeah, actually, let's have some fun with this. Other stuff other than press fit bottom brackets that would be your hill to die on.
Well, so actually, Dave Rome and I, were both just recently laid off. And so are free. We are free to do whatever we want. I don't have a non-compete or anything like that, right? So we've kicked off a little podcast. And
what is it called?
It's called,
and how do people find it?
Well, at the moment, it's called the Redundant Placeholders, because we have no idea what to call it. So if you search it, I think any of the podcast platforms, if you search Redundant Placeholders, you'll be able to find it. You can also find it on any of my social channels. I'm at Caley Fretz on everything, because I'm the only person on the planet with my name. So that's very handy. Anyway, Dave and I were talking about like, okay, so if we were actually literally talking about this yesterday, which is why it's funny that you bring up bottom brackets. Like if the bottom bracket, the anti-press fit bandwagon was the one that we were leading before, what's our new thing that we get to hate on? And we've actually decided that one of the things that we're most interested in pushing, and if you listen to the episode from this week, you would hear this, is bikes that are too stiff and just stuff that's too stiff. Yeah. So specifically, Dave this week brought up the topic of handlebars that are just like way too stiff, right? Just ridiculously stiff. We were talking about the 35 mil trend in mountain bikes, which I hate. And like, I've got a giant trail bike with 170 mil fork. And then I want to stick like just a 2x4 in my hands. I don't really understand why I want to do that. And I've ended up with like more sort of hand cramp and hand pain on this bike than I've ever had previously. And it's got more travel than any bike that I've had previously. So those two things don't really line up in my head, right? And so Dave and I were basically talking about pushing back on this need for stiffer and stiffer and stiffer and stiffer all the time, and the fact that a lot of us don't need that and really don't want it either. Not only do we not need it, we really don't want it because it makes the ride experience worse. I told a little story about how one of the best bikes I've ever ridden was a not particularly expensive Mozzie steel frame, steel fork, steel frame that I put a pair of Zip 303 carbon wheels on. So nice, light, stiff wheel set with a somewhat flexy bike, flexi fork, flexi frame, but it rode like an absolute dream. 27.2 post. It might have even not had oversized bars. I can't remember. This is like 8-9 years ago now. And I loved it. I absolutely loved this bike. It got up and went when I asked it to. I think the wheel set made a huge difference in that. But then it cornered like an absolute dream, and it was comfortable, and it was just beautiful. And it was a not particularly expensive steel Mozzie, right? Like, so that's the high horse upon which we find ourselves now. The fight for less stiff bicycles, I think, is what we're going to go after next.
Well, and you can kind of take that a step further, talking about steel frames, for example. If you get a steel frame, even a pretty decent steel frame at, say, OEM cost is going to be quite a bit less than a monocoque carbon frame. You don't have all the tooling costs and everything else, and you can change the geometry if you need to without having to retool. And those bikes are going to be inherently more affordable at the same time. And unless you're an elite racer who's having to sprint off the line or so on, you either spend less money for an equivalent bike that suits your needs well and is comfortable, or you spend the same money and you put it into, say, better wheels. You don't get the cheap out wheels with the 3 Paul hubs that fall apart in a year and what have you. Yeah, 100%. That's when I'll join you on.
That's what we're pushing.
So I'm joining the battalion.
That's what we're pushing from here on.
I've got another one for you. And this one I don't think you'll disagree with because we talked about Sea Otter. Hooks, bead hooks.
Oh.
Bead hooks on any real wheels that are marketed for use with road tubeless.
I don't feel like I like having this conversation with James or Dave around because they know the actual technical reasons. Yourself probably in the same boat. You know the actual technical reasons why this is a terrible idea or a good idea, I guess, if you're talking the other direction. I just know that essentially, like, I am kind of just a consumer these days, right? Like I said, I have not been a tech editor. It has not been my job to follow bicycle technology for close to a decade now. So I'm basically just a heavily invested consumer who pays, quite close attention, right? And as a heavily invested consumer, I cannot figure out if my wheels and tires are going to kill me at the moment. And I think that is not really an acceptable way forward. I don't think that should be allowed in the cycling space. And I every single time I say that, I get a bunch of hookless aficionados coming back at me saying that, oh, it's quite easy. This works with this and this. I'm like, yeah, but I, as a person who does not want to go through a bunch of like charts to figure out what tire to run, I don't want that. Just put hooks back on my rims. I don't care about the 40 grams or whatever it is. I just don't care.
Well, would you like some more ammo for those arguments when they come up?
Give me more ammo.
All right. So first off, it used to be the case that it was a substantial, a reasonable weight penalty and a higher cost. That is substantially mitigated by new forming techniques for the bead hooks and mini hooks that you can create that have the same impact resistance as hookless at about 5, maybe 10 grams per rim at the high end. And cost, the cost is a little bit higher, but insurance premiums aren't cheap either. And if you have a single incident, that's going to be a problem. So, it was an obvious investment when we made that choice for any wheel that we're marketing for use with anything, say, smaller than a 34. Plus, you get the compatibility with non-tubeless, as you well know. But the other part is you think about the fact that there are compatibility charts that exist, right?
I don't want compatibility charts. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, if that is the case, then maybe the tolerances are too tight. And it's actually, I'll tell you from the inside, it's actually worse than that, because any good company is going to check every single rim for its bead seat circumference, right? So those are pretty easy to get within spec. And then the tires are not all checked, to my knowledge. They're kind of randomly checked. So, okay, now you could have a variation. You only need one that's not to tolerance. But let's say both of those are in tolerance. Well, now you have the tape. And if the tape is too thick or too thin, or someone puts 2 layers on, they replace the tape or whatever, maybe it was in tolerance initially, and then you change it and you do 2 layers. Now the bead is too tight. It wants to drop into the channel and then pop over the edge of the hook. And so it's just not good. Just all sorts of not good.
I hate it so much. It's just, yeah. I mean, I was cognizant back when we were making the Nerd Alert podcast that, we didn't just want to complain about things, right? Like, we didn't just want to tell the industry that it was doing things wrong, because most of the time this industry does great things and they build lots of amazing bikes that I love to ride. There's just a couple things like this that are like, what are we doing? Like, is this the bean counters? Is it the gram counters? What counters are causing this particular? It must be the bean counters at this point, but I hate it either way.
Bean counter, and then also the marketing hypers. Right. So there's a new thing. Hookless is a new thing. Car wheels don't have hooks. Why do bicycle wheels have hooks? Well, because it's 110 PSI that people are sometimes putting in there. That's why.
Car wheels have 33 PSI. Yeah. Like a mountain bike tire. Yes. Well, we agree on that point. And I think that is one that we will continue to complain about. And I will just continue to be annoyed that I can't feel confident in what I'm riding without doing a bunch of searching and Google searching. And I don't want to have to do that.
Nor should your average rider need to rely on that in order to be safe. That's the part that I find kind of bonkers.
Average rider doesn't even know to do that. That's the problem.
Yeah, true. And the last part of that is, why do the tire pressure recommendation charts kind of go to 70 proportional with the weight, and then they just kind of taper off? That also kind of tells you something about the confidence in this, particular combination of tire and rim and pressure and so on. Mm-hmm. But all right, I guess we hop off this high horse then. That was good fun though. I could do this all day. So you mentioned Ben Delaney, and he's an interesting person to bring up because he's a mutual acquaintance, also somebody whose writing I've been reading since my early days in the industry, and also somebody who has been trying to figure out how to navigate the changing landscape in cycling media, which the business model for media in general has undergone a dramatic shift. And in his case, has his new YouTube channel and is doing a freelance work for certain publications and is making a go of it that way. But how would you describe the industry dynamics as having changed during your time in the media side?
Oh, I mean, I would say I was relatively insulated from it personally for a long time, and until I kind of reached a level of management, so to speak, that it became my problem. I didn't spend a whole lot of time thinking about it. Yeah, Ben was unfortunately the victim of an outside layoff a while ago. So he's been making a solo go of it since I think May or June of last year, or this year, 2022. And yeah, like he's experimenting, and it's good I like watching him trying to figure this out, right? Because I feel like he's kind of doing it for all of us at the moment, and trying to figure out exactly, various ways to make this thing work. And yeah, he's got his YouTube channel is great. I mean, I watch it all the time. I'm actually going to be on it sometime soon. I just recorded a thing with him picking our favorite products of the year. I think I went in a slightly different direction than probably most of his guests, because my favorite product was bar mitts for my cargo bike. So a slightly different place than probably a lot of folks he's talking to. But the media as a whole, I mean, it's rough out there. Right? Like, I have spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about this and trying to figure this out over the last couple of years, as has like Wade, my former boss at CT before he left over the summer, as is everybody. I mean, frankly, like as is Robin Thurston, the CEO of Outside, right? Like he is genuinely trying to make this thing work. And at the moment, as layoffs kind of prove, it's hard, right? It's really, really hard to get people to pay for something that they haven't had to pay for historically. You're trying to put the genie back in the bottle, right? That's what we are trying to do. And it's really, really, really difficult. And then frankly, it's one of the things we were most proud of at Cycling Tips is that we did have this core hyper engaged audience that was willing to pay us for what we did. And not only just pay us for like the content that they had access to, but pay us for the whole community that we had built. Right. I mean, there's a Velo Club, which is the sort of membership program at Cycling Tips. There's a Slack group for Velo Club, which I'm concerned about right now. But that group of people, a couple thousand people, it's not the entirety of the membership. It's like sort of the most hardcore of the membership, I would say. And it's a couple thousand people. It's sort of like its own little private forum, right? And they support each other and they ask each other questions and they ask us questions. Asked us questions. You know, when they had a tech question, they ping James, and they had a racing question, they would ping me, or they would ping Matt Denis or somebody like that, and they would also just answer each other's questions. And they built this incredible community there that, for me, underpins any successful, particularly sort of niche media or vertical media business, because those are the people that not only are they giving you money to keep the lights on, but they're your biggest advocates, right? They are your most important advocates in the space. They're the people that tell their friends. They're the people that get other people signed up. They are more important than any marketing spend you could ever possibly utilize, right? So that was one of the things we were really proud of over the last couple of years, and I think that is a model in some ways for going forward. So, you know, like I said, I don't have a non-compete. I can start anything I want right now, and to be very blunt, like I fully plan to. I think
you absolutely should, because you clearly have an audience that misses your voice and that values what you brought to the table.
Yeah, and I would say, like, honestly, it's less my voice and it's more like Dave Rome and Matt and like the rest of the crew, because I do like to put the folks that were writing day in, day out for CT like well ahead of anything that I was doing. But I did spend more time than they did thinking about how to build a media business. And so, yeah, we want to do something here. It's only been a couple of weeks since we were let go, so we're still figuring out what the details are. But like I said, we've already kicked off a little podcast. We know that there's a lot of people out there that are kind of waiting for this, and we will just try to give them what they want, I guess. I mean, in my mind, the ideal sort of media entity of the future, and I've used this term a couple times with Dave in talking about these things, is essentially an aggregation of niches or niches, depending on which pronunciation you prefer. So rather than try to go really broad and talk about a little bit of everything, which tends to be kind of the model across most of cycling media, I prefer a concept where you essentially allow editors to dive into their interests and their strengths, right? You take Dave Rome and you say, Dave, you love tools. You're a real weirdo about it, but we appreciate your weirdness, and we embrace it and do it. Like, tell me everything you can possibly tell me about tools, because I'm pretty sure there's an audience there. And even if it's not that big, even if it's a couple thousand people, if they are hyper engaged with you, a couple thousand people in a recurring membership model, recurring revenue model, is enough to pay Dave plus some, right? And then you sort of you take that concept and you expand it out, and yeah, it becomes the basis by which you can build a media entity that I think is sustainable. Now, nothing I'm saying here is wholly original, right? Like, this is broadly the direction that a lot of different media entities are going. Anybody who sort of follows that world, there's a new politics site called Semaphore that is essentially the same rough concept, right? You dive headlong into particular beats. You provide a ton of depth in those beats. You hit the audience, people who really care about that particular topic, and you pull that group in, and then you do the same thing over here and you pull that group in. You do the same thing over here and you pull that group in. And there's for sure people that care about more than one, obviously, but you really you focus really deep on each one of these things. And that's the if I could build something, and I, like I said, I intend to try, that's the concept I think that makes the most sense to me from a business perspective, from an editorial perspective, from every perspective I can think of, basically.
Yeah. So I've had folks like Russ Roca from Path Less Pedaled on the pod. He has a YouTube channel you may or may not be familiar with, but that's become his livelihood, right? And he has sustainers through Patreon. He doesn't do endorsements and things like that. I don't think he's doing any sort of sponsored episodes or anything of that sort. And he's been able to make a living. And there are obviously plenty of YouTuber influencer types who may have less scruples about promoting things and things of that sort. But I'm curious, either within bike or outside of bike, what projects do you see succeeding in the model that you could imagine emulating or building upon? Because I've seen a bunch of attempts at it, and it's a really tough nut to crack.
It's a tough nut to crack. I would say that the biggest and most obvious is The Athletic, which was just purchased by the New York Times for something like, I think it was $425 million. Now,
oh wow!
So the sort of caveat around that is that that's probably less than they were actually hoping for. This is a VC-funded media entity that primarily covers ball sports, and their whole thing was you essentially apply the beat reporter model of like a local newspaper. The Denver Post, for example, will have a Broncos beat reporter. Then all they do is talk about the Broncos, right? And they're even allowed to kind of be fans of the Broncos a little bit. They take that and they apply it to every single ball sport. So both types of football, baseball, basketball, all the rest. And they apply a beat reporter to every major team. And sometimes more than one beat reporter to really big teams. Like if we're talking English Premier League, Manchester United has a couple different writers on it. Aston Villa has probably one, right? So, but even so, if you're a massive Aston Villa fan and you just want your Aston Villa news, you can go. That The Athletic's going to have it because they have a person who is dedicated to your team and nothing else but your team. So you can also get okay, well, I want some broader. I want World Cup news. I want the Manchester United news. I want the Ronaldo news, but I really want my Aston Villa guy, right? That is essentially the same model that I'm talking about, where I believe that people really want Dave Rome's tool stuff. They probably also care about lots of other things that we will write about, but they really want Dave Rome's tool stuff. And that's probably the thing that's actually going to get them across the line from a membership perspective, right? Is that deep, deep, deep love of this one thing that a content creator they like is talking about. That's the kind of thing that moves the needle. And so, yeah, The Athletic is kind of the biggest, most obvious example of this kind of working. They made, I think, some strategic errors early on in the way that they pulled staff together that made it quite an expensive organization to run. And I think that's probably part of the reason why they didn't get quite as much cash for it as they thought. But still, building a media entity from nothing in the last, I think it started 5 years ago or so. I remember sitting at a Tour de France press buffet with some of the British. So at the time, it was Sky era. A lot of big name British sports writers were coming over the tour, and a couple of those guys were talking about job offers from The Athletic and actually how insanely well paid they were going to be. So I think
these are full-time positions. We're not talking just shifting everything to freelance like so many these techie VC funded models do.
No, I mean I mean perhaps they're contractors or something, but these individuals are writing a story a day most of the time about the particular beat that they're talking about, or story every other day, depending on the writer probably. But anyway, about 5 years ago. So you've got a media entity that's only about 5 years old and just sold to the New York Times for $500,000 or whatever it was, or sorry, $500 million.
Yeah,
that's a success story in my mind, and shows that the model can work. I think there's no guarantees, and that's a scale that I don't really have any need, want, or desire to come anywhere near. But I do think that the core, essentially, value proposition of membership that they showed worked. It can work elsewhere. It can work in cycling. Can work across endurance media, I think.
Well, and again, with my kind of very cursory understanding of the space, they were acquired by the New York Times, which itself went through its own economic model crisis and had to make the switch to a paywall. and the quality of the content was sufficient that they're making such large acquisitions. So they must be doing something right.
Mm-hmm.
They're not the failing New York Times, as some folks called them a few years ago. I think there's also something to be said for consolidating quality and having the interaction of the sort that you did at Cycling Tips, not just through a Velo Club, but also just the comments section. It was a very unique space, and your team was in there interacting, and the nature of the communication that I saw, the way that your readers were engaging, it didn't seem hierarchical at all. It was a conversation with you and your team, and that was very, very cool to see. And that was something quite special that I think is more consequence of the people involved than of the particular platform. As special as Cycling Tips was, and I was one of the early readers. Those are my racing days when it was literally just the blog, and it was pointers on how to train. It was the cool thing at the time, and actual cycling tips. Yeah, that name was directly correlated with the content. But I don't know if I've shared this with you, but in addition to the podcast, which is founded by Craig Dalton, we also started this Slack community called the Ridership, which also is a bit over a couple thousand members and also has these like healthy dynamics. We call it a community of riders helping riders. And that was directly inspired by what you guys do at Velo Club. I saw what you were doing over there. It was just something that wanted to emulate, found inspiring, saw a place for. And I'd be curious, one of the things that Craig and I have talked about is some form of shared platform that's somehow democratically governed, where content creators and those who are engaging with their content, who want to support them and so on, can all meet. And having that be something centralized in the sense that it's all meeting in the same place, but decentralized in terms of the governance structure, and then maybe even set up as a nonprofit. I'm curious if you've had any thoughts around that sort of thing.
Yeah, I've actually sort of played around with similar ideas. In this, again, in the sort of couple weeks that I've been thinking about, really thinking about this now, we thought through, so ironically, one of the things that there's been a fair number of complaints around with outside was essentially like Web3 and NFT stuff. However, some of that technology would actually make something like what you're talking about potentially work quite a bit better. Again, I haven't spent, we didn't go too far down this rabbit hole because we feel like getting something off the ground relatively quickly is a priority. But I agree that something, I mean, platforms work, right? Like that's essentially that's all YouTube is. It's just a platform for other people to put content on. They monetize it over top. They give you a cut. They take most of it. It's a pretty good business, actually. So like, could you do that for endurance sports? Perhaps, probably. Are there enough really high quality individual content creators out there to make that work? Probably, maybe. Like, are there enough Ben Delaney's who would love to probably work with a platform that increased their visibility, but in exchange for a cut of whatever he's making? Probably. I mean, that's essentially the deal that he's made with YouTube, right? Like we were saying. So I think there's something there. I think it'd be incredibly difficult to get off the ground, and would almost have to be quite organic. And you'd have to be kind of willing to sit on it and let it grow for quite some time, or sit on a bunch of investment money and do it that way, which I don't necessarily have the time for at this point in time. But I like the idea. I like it genuinely. I've had a lot of conversations with other people in bike media over the last couple of weeks, because for obvious reasons, people giving me a ring, a lot of them are saying basically like, hey, I'm sorry, just checking in on you, stuff like that. And we get to talking about this sort of thing. And one of the things that keeps coming up is this desire to stop competing so directly with each other as bike media, right? Like, the space is too small. We all do our own thing. We talk to maybe the same audience in general, but we talk to them in very different ways. And like I've been on the phone with editor-in-chiefs of a couple different major bike outlets in the last week, and all have said something along those lines. And I think that some sort of collective would hit the same. Yeah, it would hit the same themes there, right? Of a desire to provide a space for everybody to just create really good work that they actually get paid for. Because that's the hard thing. Again, you're still talking about putting the genie back in the bottle. You're still talking about trying to get people to pay for something that they historically haven't paid for, or you're running an advertising-based model, which is incredibly difficult. And in this particular moment is very, very difficult. I mean, Robin, the CEO of Outside, mentioned that specifically in the letter that came along with these layoffs. Is like the advertising world out there right now, particularly in endemic media like cycling, is bad. It is bad news. They're looking into 2023 and seeing steep drop-offs in the amount that is being spent. So you run up against kind of similar problems, I think, with that model, but it is certainly something that is, the incentives to me feel like they're lined up for creators in a model like that, right? Because they, if done right, they would directly benefit from their work. Whereas, something that's always kind of frustrated me in this space is like the value of myself and editorial teams have increased the value of entities tremendously over my career, and then they get sold and I see none of it. And so like the incentive structure is not great within most of bike media.
Yeah, it's bad enough in the tech space where there are stock options, but generally to the founder goes most of the spoils, even though, and I say this as a founder, I don't create most of the value, right? Nothing that I could do would get off the ground without all the other people who make it happen. And so it's only right that there be a distribution of ownership and a sharing of the rewards if there's success, which in turn incentivizes success. In the case of Cycling Tips, in reading the comments, it's very clear that the readership knows it. Yeah. They're not there for Cycling Tips. Cycling Tips is the banner under which all the people whose perspectives they valued, that's where those people are. And so your standalone brand and that of your colleagues has value, and has value in particular if it's brought in a single place where people can interact with you as they had in the past. It's a terrible thing to lose. And whatever the reasons for it, obviously there are economic headwinds, but it's unfortunate. But there's a saying that I live by that seems to apply, which is change happens when the fear of change is less than the pain of staying the same. And there's nothing quite like a radically changing economic model or layoffs or things like that make staying the same really painful. And so whether the fear has changed or not, time to take the leap. And people like yourself and Ben and others have been making that leap. I wonder, you mentioned that some sort of platform would have to either be funded by a bunch of VC money, which honestly, I don't. If you want to end up with a small fortune, start with a big one. Throwing VC money at things is a really good way to end up with Juicero. I don't know if you recall that.
Oh, yes.
$130 or $160 million of Sandhill Road money lit on fire for a glorified electric press. For if anyone's curious, look this up. It'll make you feel that, it'll make you question the judgment of Silicon Valley in a way that I have learned to from the inside over the years. But the organic piece, let's unpack that, because I have a couple of ideas that I'd like to bounce off of you. So platforms like YouTube, I suspect it's going to be very hard for somebody who has an audience on YouTube or who wants to build an audience to leave YouTube. But having a platform that is essentially an aggregator. So if you're a content creator, wherever your content is, this is the one place where you can find all of it, along with categorized content from other players. So you want to learn about tools, you have Dave Rome's YouTube videos about tools, you have his podcasts about tools, you have other content creators' content there. And then it becomes kind of platform agnostic, like you can be anywhere, but this is the place where you go to find it. And this is the place where you go to interact. Because the YouTube comments, that's not an interaction space. That's largely a trolling space, or it's a largely one-directional sorts of conversation happening. Even the healthiest version of it is still not a conversation. But if you have a YouTube video embedded in a community platform, now all of a sudden people are in digital community together, and not just over, say, Dave and his tool-based content or his tool-focused content. Not to say that's all he does, but using that as an example, but also Dave in community in his local chapter, right? In his local riding community. And in the context of a place where people are also going for James's bike reviews and your Tour de France coverage and things like this. That's one model that I've wondered, like, if there was such a platform.
How do you monetize it? Is it paywalled?
That's a big question, right?
Well, so the reason I ask is because I would see a couple different options, right?
Yeah.
And we're getting into real sort of media theory here, but
this was actually part of the conversation I wanted to have with you long before all these changes, and it's something we've discussed on the pod before as well with other content creators.
I think so. I'll say that first and foremost that I'm not anti-paywall. I know some others are in the media space, but I fundamentally believe that if done properly, you're essentially only targeting. So I'm a big advocate of what we call metered paywall, which is basically you get a couple free stories in a given amount of time, whatever the number is, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, whatever you want, and then at some point you pay. Right now, the nice thing about that is that if we take let's take a hypothetical cycling media outlet with somewhere in we'll call it 2 million unique users a month. Right, you've got 2 million people showing up on a website every month. The number of people who are actually going to get to the paywall, that are going to go to enough stories to get to that paywall, is probably something in the neighborhood of like less than 5% of those people. It's a tiny number, because a huge number of those people are coming in from Google. They're SEO. They're coming into SEO stories. They're coming into how to bed in my disc brakes, and they're in, and they find out how to do that, and they are out, right? And that's the only interaction you have with them. And they're useful from a page views perspective if you're monetizing that, but they're not particularly useful from a membership perspective, because who's going to pay to get one story, right? That doesn't make any sense. So you're really only trying to monetize your super users. So your super users are that 5%, the people that actually end up hitting the paywall. And part of the reason why I'm not anti-paywall is because those people, that small group of people that is coming back day after day after day after day, they value you. And if they truly value you, they should pay for you. Like, I don't have any problem with, we put a ton of time and energy and effort into this, and it is our jobs, and we need to get paid. And if people appreciate what we're doing enough to come back every single day, and they're not willing to pay for that, then as far as I'm concerned, they need to look at themselves and ask why, right? Like, all I'm asking for is $8 a month or whatever to continue doing, so that you can do something that you do every single day, that you enjoy, that you gain information and entertainment from, inspiration from even. I think that that's a pretty reasonable trade-off. I don't really have any problem asking the super user to do that. I think that there are other paywall versions of a paywall that I don't agree with sort of philosophically. I don't agree with paywalling 100% of content. I also think that just ruins your discoverability, and it doesn't allow anybody to...
I was going to say, is it a philosophical thing, or is it more just practically like you're going to cut off all the channels for discovery?
Both. Yeah. It realistically, like I said, your discoverability goes to zero. People can't tell that you make good content. I have kind of a similar issue with the like premium content model. So you give away your crappy stuff for free, and the really good stuff you got to pay for. Like, I don't like that either, because why? Then anybody scrolling around your website is going to be like, well, the only things I can read are crap, so why would I pay for that? I don't know the good stuff.
It's a poor pitch.
Yeah, it's a bad pitch. So I have issues with that. Yeah. I also just like philosophically, the sort of fully hard paywall that you can't read anything without paying, beyond the discoverability problems. I just kind of have issues with that, because like, if we do write a how to bed in your disc brakes so they don't make noise story, like, I want people to be able to access that, right? Like, then I don't have to listen to people's loud disc brakes. Like, people, I have no problem sort of providing that much content to somebody for free. And I think that fully paywalling that isn't great. But again, I'm not against paywalls in general. Meter paywalls, I think, work quite well. We know that they are effective. They can be incredibly effective, particularly if you have the sort of requisite, essentially, story volume to make them work, and sort of audience size to make them work. So given that, like the sort of concept that you're talking about, paywall seems like a good way forward, because again, you're sort of avoiding the need to chase advertising dollars constantly. And this is going to be somewhat a reflection of what I'm thinking for myself going forward. Obviously, you're avoiding chasing advertising dollars incessantly, which, I'm not against advertising either. I think the right advertising partners can be crucial, right? They provide lots of actually value to an audience at some point, right? The fact that you get bikes to test, the fact that you have a good relationship there, those are all valuable things. So I'm not anti-advertising either. I'm just more anti constantly chasing every single cent you can possibly get out of advertising, and the sort of the extra resource that very concept requires. And so, yeah, some sort of like membership driven thing lines up with the sort of ethos of what you're talking about, which is very community driven. We know communities are willing to invest in their own space where they can be a community, and so that would make sense as well. And if you start to do things like add too much advertising to something like that, then the incentives start to shift because you start working for the advertisers instead of working for the community. And that, I think, goes against the whole ethos that you're talking about, of this sort of communal thing. So that would be my 2 cents on how to build something like that. Like I said, it is a concept that we played around with, and I've played around with in my head for some time, actually. I personally, again, it's more of a time issue for me than anything. Not that I don't think it could be cool and don't think it could work. I just think that to build that community would take quite a bit of time, and also figuring out the precise method of paying. So the other roadblock that I came across when I was thinking through this was the precise method of paying content creators in that scenario gets quite complicated. Because are you paying them by page view? Are you paying them? Is there a tip jar? Is there some sort of rank voting system when people sign up? Like, I like these 3 creators and I don't like these 3, and so the top 3 get my money and the other 3 don't. That starts to create some perverse incentives toward bad content as well, right? And essentially that is the YouTube problem. The YouTube problem is that YouTube is incentivized for clickbait. It's incentivized for garbage content because that's the stuff that gets picked up. And think about your average like YouTube headline or YouTube sort of title card versus what you would find on a site like Cycling Tips these days, right? It's a dramatic difference. Like we would have to change headlines depending on whether it was going on YouTube or going on the site back in the day, because YouTube is incentivized to be like all caps and exclamation points and somebody crashing in the title card and all these things that we kind of hate, because that's what you end up with.
Caley Fretz destroys XYZ.
Exactly. So after the monetization question, how do you actually split up that money with the content creators? It's a again, I love the idea, I love the concept, but the sort of those particular decisions be crucial to success and crucial to it actually working for the people that you would want it to work for. And it'd be hard. It'd be really hard. I don't have the solution to those questions, which is why I again thought through a lot of this and thought through a similar concept, not identical, but a similar concept, and basically came to the conclusion that in the near term, a slightly more traditional model is not the worst thing in the world, right? Like, build really good content, pay people for it, make people pay for it. That's essentially the 3-part business plan of most membership-driven media entities these days. Does that all make sense? I feel like I went a bit of a rant there.
Not at all. Not at all. And in fact, it's a conversation I'd like to continue, because I have a few ideas that probably we don't want to dedicate a whole episode to just this conversation, but certainly appreciate you pulling back the curtain on the sorts of things that you, as an editor in the space and an editor for one of the most respected publications in the space, and for good reason, providing that perspective and the sorts of things that you're thinking about from this new vantage point is very much appreciative. So thank you for that. I want to go in a completely different direction. What are the pieces that you've written that you most enjoyed or found most challenging or that were most meaningful for you as a writer?
Internally at Cycling Tips, we called them riddles. It was a term that Ian Treloar coined for his little essays, right? There's a couple of those that I really enjoyed writing and liked writing. It's just sort of the pure act of sort of language, basically, like playing with language, which is still fundamentally like why I started doing this to begin with, is because I really enjoyed doing that. And in the last couple of years have stepped away from writing almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely. And so when I did get a chance to write, it was always meaningful, and I liked it. That tended to be at things like the Tour de France, where I would essentially send myself because I wanted to go cover the Tour de France again. I have plenty of talented writers that reporters that could have gone instead of me, but at some point you pull the boss card and I'm like, I'm going to the Tour. So yeah, there's a couple of pieces on that front. Actually, one of the first pieces I ever wrote for CyclingTips, it was called The Road to Nairo's House. And it was about a trip that my wife and I and two friends took to Colombia. And it like half the photos are broken on it now. It's from like 2017. It's like 6,500 words of a trip around Colombia and all the sort of things that riding in Colombia, particularly in 2017, meant. Sort of keeping in mind that a relatively large and disastrous war there only kind of wrapped up around the 2010 mark, depending on who you ask. So I really enjoyed that piece. And then, yeah, like these little riddles, there's a couple that I've written over my career that you tend to write them in 20 minutes, right? Because something just hits you in the head and you just get it out. But because of that, they're very pure, I think. I wrote one about the toe strap that my dad would use to attach a sock full of tube, tire, CO2, flat fixing implements underneath his saddle, right? And he would strap this thing underneath his saddle with a strap, like a tube sock underneath his saddle with a toe strap, like a leather toe strap. And I wrote this story about how, I just remember when I was 12, 13 years old, and my dad is obviously a much stronger cyclist than me at that point, and just trying to stay on his wheel with this toe strap dangling in front of me. It's like I just need to stay on the toe strap. Wrote a piece about that at some point that I ended up, I really liked, and it was meaningful to me because of my relationship with my dad is very tied into my relationship with cycling, because we grew up doing it together and still ride together when we can and things like that. There was one about eating cassoulet and Carcassonne during a rest day, Tour de France, that I liked. Again, these
what's cassoulet and Carcassonne?
Cassoulet is like
I'm not so fancy.
It's like a meaty stew thing. White beans and some meat. And Carcassonne is a town in southern France with a big kind of World Heritage Site castle over top of it, and it's always hot as hell there. They often have rest days there at the Tour. It's always hot as hell, and I have yet to find a hotel or an Airbnb there that has air conditioning. So you're always just baking, second rest day of the Tour de France. I think I was sitting in a cafe and I had a couple of rosés like you do, and eating a cassoulet, which is also hot. So I'm hot eating a hot cassoulet and just watching the world kind of go by, like the sort of Tour de France rest day world going by. And, like Greg Van Avermaet coming up and stopping at a red light. I wrote the story a while ago, and I'm trying to remember what I even talked about. Craig Van Avermaet, he came up and stopped at a red light while a bunch of amateur cyclists blew right through it, and he's like, "Nah, I'm gonna stop at the red light." A proper professional cyclist. Yeah, just silly stories like that stick in my mind. And interestingly, I find they tend to stick in readers' minds. When I got laid off, those are the kind of stories that people were sending me, being like, "Hey, I love this when you wrote it. Thanks for everything you've done," kind of thing. Which is, as somebody who creates things for a living, when you realize that people actually read them and liked them, that's a pretty special thing. So yeah, Road to Nairo's House, rest day, something at a Tour de France. I can't remember what the headline was, and I think it was called The Teaching Toe Strap, which was actually a Velo News story back in the day. Those are probably three of my favorites.
I have never been much of a writer. I barely got out of undergrad and grad school, largely because I struggled with the thesis papers for each. So writing has always been a challenge for me. Too much of a perfectionist with not enough of a honed mastery of the skill. But there is something that I get as a product creator. There are the things that you create because you have to create them. And there are things that you create because you just have to. Mm-hmm. You have to for your own reasons. And when people resonate with that, it's just immensely gratifying.
Yeah.
And, I've appreciated your work and the work of your colleagues at CyclingTips during your tenure there. And you definitely built something special there. So excited to see what you do in this next chapter.
Thank you. Yeah.
So you already hinted a little bit at this, but what does the bike mean for you? What role has it played in your life? Why do you care so much about this two-wheeled vehicle?
I mean, it's changed so many times for me. I think that's it's almost an impossible thing to answer, because you could ask me that as a 13, 14-year-old, showing up in spandex to high school and getting lots of weird looks. And it would mean a very different thing to me then as it did when I was, 20, 21 and, weighing up a quote unquote professional contract for $3,000 a year and live in a van to, the middle of my Velo News era to now where, like the bike that I rode more than any other bike in 2022 was a cargo bucket bike that I ride my daughter to her to daycare in every single day. I rode that thing 2,700 miles in 1 year, 3 miles at a time. So
with your daughter in it half the time.
Yeah.
More or less.
Yeah. So
so that's a lot of
there and back
really
every
good
single
quality
morning.
father-daughter time.
Totally. There and back every morning, there and back every afternoon. And yeah, quality father-daughter time. And, one of the most sort of enjoyable half hour of my day. So yeah, it's almost an impossible question for me to answer at this point, other than like, they're the through line for everything in my life since I was 10. It's just, that's the thread that holds it all together, right? That it was the thing that made me weird in high school. It was the thing that consumed me in college to the point of probably the detriment of my actual grades. It was the thing that provided me a step into what has become a very enjoyable career. And now it's the thing that I use to just get my daughter around, which is like special in its own sort of indescribable way. So yeah, I guess that's the answer. It's the thread. It's the thing that holds all the other things together, basically.
It reminds me of a quote about marriage, which is, I've been married many times. It just so happens to have been to the same person. Yeah. And it's like this reinvention, this new relationship to ostensibly the same thing. I can very much relate to that with the bike as well. But yeah, it has been a delight being able to finally sit down and have this sort of really focused quality conversation with you, Kaylee.
That was great.
And wish you the best with your future endeavors. And let's absolutely keep in touch, maybe have you back on when you have the next thing that you're talking about.
Yeah. Talk to me in January. That's what we're looking at.
Sounds good,
now.
amigo. All right. Take care, my friend.
Thanks.
Big thanks to Randall and Kaylee for having that conversation. Super fascinating subject matter when you think about the economics of cycling journalism and how consumers are willing to pay for it. I hope every listener of the podcast here values cycling journalists and find ways to contribute to their ongoing efforts to cover the sport we love. If you're interested in connecting with myself or Randall or potentially even Kaylee, please join the Ridership. It's over at www.theridership.com. That's a free global cycling community where you can connect and talk about all the things you love about gravel cycling. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, ratings and reviews are hugely appreciated. So if you enjoyed this episode, please go to your favorite podcast platform and just drop us a quick review. And if you're feeling especially helpful, feel free to share this episode with a friend. That's a great way to get new people involved in the Gravel Ride podcast. Until next time, here's to finding some dirt under your wheels.